Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the last quarterly housing forum of the year. It's December. We've made special arrangements since it's such a cold morning that you could join us, many of you from home. But we continue the housing forum. We've got a great program today. We're going to have a conversation on the history of systemic racism in the U.S. housing policy and how that has impacted our city and our region. I think it'll be a robust conversation. Since our last meeting, we have elected a new administration, and congratulate us. We've voted once and counted 3 times in Georgia. We have a vaccine on the horizon, and hopefully we'll get back to a new normal in 2021. And we've learned a lot, I think, during the pandemic, particularly about housing, affordable housing and access and people's ability to sustain through times like this. So that's really what we're going to focus on today. Before we go into the topic, we've got several representatives here. This is kind of the time in the program where we do announcements. And so we want to come back to an announcement that we first heard at our last meeting. There's an effort called SOAR that has been organized over the last 3 months to really focus on eviction relief. And we're going to learn more about that. It's a huge issue. It's a tsunami coming at us, and thank goodness the community has organized around that. So I want to invite John Berry, who we all know has worked at St. Vincent de Paul and has been a great partner through the years in the work, and he's the new executive director of SOAR, and Dave Moody, who has agreed to be chairman of the board. Dave, an entrepreneur, but I think most importantly, a social activist and supporter of good things in Atlanta and the region. So let me turn it over to you guys for an update on the SOAR effort.
All right. Thank you, Bill. As Bill mentioned, I'm honored to have been selected as the executive director of the SOAR effort. Some of you may know, after 14 years at St. Vincent de Paul, I retired in September, and that lasted less than 60 days, and I came back to this effort because the urgency and the importance and the necessity of supporting people in this eviction crisis was an overwhelming need, and I'm thrilled and excited to be able to help in any way that I can in this role. For those of you that were on the September forum, you learned about SOAR and the fact that it was in its planning phase. The organization was created by a very impressive group of corporate and civic leaders who in the fall came together to try and come up with a shared goal of accelerating the community's response to this rental relief effort in order to mitigate what we all know is an impending eviction crisis. So today I'm really excited to let everybody know that SOAR has now moved into from the planning phase into an execution phase. And over the next couple of weeks, we will be hopefully bringing in money from a number of different sources to stave off the eviction crisis as the CDC various moratoria are lifted. For those who have looked at this crisis, and I know most of you have, the Atlanta Regional Commission studies is showing that there's about 80,000 households in the 10-county metropolitan area that we at SOAR are going to focus on to try and help people satisfy their rent obligations and maintain themselves in stable housing. We know we're not going to be able to serve all those people, but with community support, we feel like we're really going to be able to provide meaningful financial relief to thousands of those low-income renters and keep them safely housed, which is incredibly important, even more so under the global health crisis that we're in the midst of as we go along with this. One of the things that attracted me to SOAR and the approach is that there is a very ambitious but achievable goal of helping those people through a unique shared buy-in strategy. we will be asking landlords to forgive a back portion or a portion of back rent owed in exchange for SOAR funding to cover the rest. We're going to ask landlords to discount a portion of go-forward rent for several months, and then the tenants will pay what they can, and SOAR will come in and fill the gap. So everybody's got skin in the game, and this is not something that's just theoretical. There's been active engagement with landlords in conversations, and we have a pretty solid buy-in from that constituency to support this approach. One of the things that will be important to that is any landlord who receives funding from SOAR must agree not to pursue evictions for those tenants for financial reasons for the time they're participating in our program. It's not just a one-time Band-Aid, it's a continuing support effort. Our hope is to bridge the current moment to the next round of federal relief for housing. Our founder, Jack Harden, likes to say that we're here to be holding down the fort until the cavalry arrives. And with the new administration, hopefully that cavalry will arrive early in 2021. We know that many of you on this call are deeply involved in the trenches of this work now, and I want to assure you that the goal of SOAR is not to reinvent the wheel, but rather to build on successful strategies and maximize resources to ensure that we can quickly and efficiently get funds to those in need. So for the next several months, we think SOAR will be an all hands on deck community imperative, and that working together, we can keep thousands of people afloat. This is work I deeply believe in. I spent 14 years of my life leading St. Vincent de Paul, where housing and keeping people stable and self-sufficient was the core of what we do. So I'm just honored and thrilled to be part of this, and I look forward to all of us working together to come up with a great solution. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to the SOAR board chair, Dave Moody, and let him talk to you a little bit about what he has to say and what's coming up next. Dave?
All right, thanks so much, John. And I just noticed the first three of us speaking all have beards. I don't know if this is Corona beards or what. So anyway, John, thanks so much, and I'm really glad to have you at the helm. When I got the call from Doug Hooker asking me to chair this important event, at first I was like, oh man, I'm getting ready to chill out. Then he told me about what this was about, and I just couldn't say no. And it was very important to me for a couple of reasons. I posted on social media 2 days ago to try and inspire people how in the mid-'80s, my wife and I were struggling financially. I was trying to become an entrepreneur, and it was tough. And we had to call our mortgage company and all our creditors to see if they would reduce our payments and work with us. And I'll never forget how stressful that was, the anxiety that came with that. And then also, as many of you know, I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and I speak about turning the trauma into triumph. Wondering if you're going to have a place to live is traumatic. And I want to try and make sure as the board chair that we do as much as we can as a community to help prevent people having unnecessary trauma and also people being homeless. And I know that feeling, and I was fortunate enough to get through and make it. But that's a horrible, horrible feeling not to know if you're going to have a place to live because of something that's out of your control, such as COVID and so many people losing jobs. And to try and live with this uncertainty, we have a responsibility to help. So I'm excited about this. We have a terrific board assembled with some of Atlanta's finest leaders, most compassionate hearts. And I'm confident in this team to execute on this bold and in short order. So how can we help? In the coming weeks, we will launch our fundraising efforts to secure financial support for the SOAR strategy. We will need corporate and civic leaders like you to participate at every level, knowing that your dollars will be leveraged with strategies and buy-in from the public sector, landlords, and tenants themselves. We're all in this together. Can you imagine what it's like? And all of us probably been there one time, having more going out than we have coming in, and just wondering will we have a place for our children to live. With your support, we can save lives and livelihoods by keeping people housed, and in doing so, to help Atlanta not only weather this storm, but come out strong on the other end. Can you imagine what it's going to do for the morale of our city, for people to know that we pulled together to keep them from being evicted, but also to the landlords who are wondering what they're going to do, especially the smaller landlords who are trying to figure out, are they going to even be able to keep their buildings? If you have any questions or want to learn more, I know I speak for John and Bill when I say that any of us would welcome a conversation. Thank you and stay tuned. We look forward to sharing more in the days to come, and have an incredible holiday. And we're going to get through this together, folks. I'm looking forward to being with you.
Thanks so much, Dave. Dave chilling out is not an image I have, but we appreciate your stepping up yet again to a civic challenge. And John, all I can say is retirement just doesn't work out for some folks. So thanks for stepping up. Now we should expect to see something, what, by the first of the year?
I think that by the first of the year, there'll definitely be some things that people see. Between now and the first of the year, I've already started reaching out to some of the organizations that are doing this work to consult with them. So I look forward to hearing from anybody who wants to get in touch with me and be proactive. But we're moving now. We're moving forward.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you, and we look forward to getting updates. I mean, this really does feed into the conversation today, because what we're really trying to address are folks who aren't able to make it through a tough time, and that often is a result of bad policy. So we're going to address that. Another announcement, and you've all read about it, but I want to congratulate our own Terry Lee, who is moving now to be the COO of Atlanta Housing. Terry has been a mainstay in the city, our go-to person. I want to congratulate Eugene Jones, the CEO, for getting Terry on the team. And Terry, just congratulations on this new role and this new responsibility. We're all here to work with you. So thank you very much. And I also want to just do quick thank yous. I usually do it at the end, but a lot of folks aren't here at the end. We had lots of planning calls this year. So for the planning group, James Alexander from Mercy Housing, Marissa Ghani from ARC, our host, Bruce Gunner, who's always got great ideas, and our producer, George Bergen from A&DP. And thank you, John O'Callahan from A&DP, for loaning us George. And for the advisory board, you can see it up on the screen today. We've had several meetings to get input from advisory board and the larger community, and then the planning committee has put this program together. So thank you, everyone. We are all experimenting with this new technology of getting on YouTube or Zoom to come to meetings. We've always said probably the most important part of our Housing Forum meeting was getting together before the meeting and after the meeting, and we can't do that now. But we are interjecting now questions so that we can be more interactive. You're free to ask questions after the presentation. But I've asked today Odetta McLeish-White from Transformation Alliance to kind of lead us. Hi, Odetta. Who better? And Odetta, I see the first one on screen without a beard today, but much more beautiful than the previous presenter. So Odetta, if you can lead us in a couple of questions to those participating today. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I might not have the beard, but I have got some corona length going on. It's a little more silver than there was at the beginning of the year, for sure. Thank you so much for including me in today's event. And this is our chance just to sort of throughout the program, just ask a few questions and get some response to try and generate that sense of conversation that we so enjoyed when we could get together in person. The first thing we'd like to know is who's here this morning. So we're using the Mentimeter a platform to ask these questions. The screen at the very top will have www.menti.com, excuse me, it might be a little small, MENTI.com. Please, either on your smartphone, your device, or on your laptop, open up a new browser and go to that address. And there's a code there that when you put it in, it will bring up that first question and give us a sense of who is joining us today. And we can actually see things change in real time according to the category. So that's always a fun and interactive thing. One thing I'll also let everyone know here at the beginning is now that you're into the Menti survey tool for this event, you might see next question when you're finished answering this one. Hold off for a little while. Bill and I will guide you through when it's time to do polling, okay? So you're going to need to see a few things and hear a few things before you'll be ready to answer future questions. So we'll just take a moment and you can watch the pretty colors change on our wheel as we see who has been able to join us today.
You seeing any surprises here, Odetta?
No, this is looking like what we would have seen if we had done this in person, I think. I'm always interested to see the concerned citizen piece of the wheel, just because that's an area where you maybe don't have, a job or a salary or something helping you get there, or a specific mission. So those are the folks I'm so intrigued by, that they are driven enough to come on board and stay educated.
I'm also encouraged of how many people are here from the public sector, because what we emphasize all the time and what SOAR will represent, what Housing ATL represents, is public-private partnerships.
That's right.
We're partnering today in this forum.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I don't see the numbers shifting too much right now. I think we've probably reached, a maximum reporting point. And so welcome to everyone, our nonprofits, public sector, private sector, concerned citizens, and advocacy organizations. I think this will be a really interesting discussion for all of us to be having together today.
All right, we'll see you a little bit later.
Sounds good.
All right, thanks so much, Odetta. Let me frame up today's topic. And we've certainly alluded to wanting to focus on this, and today's the day. So for many, the events of 2020 have spurred a long-needed national awakening on the issues of inequality, injustice, and systemic racism. One needs to look no further than the history of American housing policy to witness the terrible impacts of systemic racism. When we have something like a pandemic, it makes it crystal clear where policies have been helpful and where they've not been helpful. So the question, how did decades of misbegotten policy, attitudes, and actions create concentrated poverty, cripple transportation policy, and diminish public infrastructure? And how do actions taken during Reconstruction in the era of Jim Crow continue to shape our city and region today? And how did these policies impact economic opportunity for communities of color? At the core of the wealth gap between Black and white households, and we know in the Atlanta region, we're at the top of the list of that gap between those who have the opportunity to leave poverty. So at the core of the wealth gap between Black and white households is wealth created through home ownership and passed on to the next generation. Black families were denied equal access to those home ownership opportunities decade after decade, resulting in home ownership gap of 30% and only 10% of the average wealth compared to white families. Let me just say that again. Resulting in the home ownership gap of 30% and only 10% of the average wealth compared to white families. To tee up our conversation today, we're going to take a look at a discriminatory housing policy through the years, as told by the Segregated by Design video, based on Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law. That book, it really is our Bible, and I would encourage, it's a dense book, but I would encourage anyone who's intrigued by the video today, which really captures the essence of that book and that research, to make this part of your library. So let's go to the video, Segregated by Design. This is the first time we've really shown a video at the Housing Forum. It just seemed like really getting to the essence better than any one of us could say it. So we'll be following that with conversation with Michael Thurmon, and I'll do introductions in a few minutes. So George, if you'll key up the video, stick with us, everyone. This is very important.
In the middle of the 20th century, the city of St. Louis, Missouri, and the United States federal government condemned and demolished the neighborhoods in downtown St. Louis where African Americans lived, displacing thousands. They built the Gateway Arch. They built a university, interstate highways, hospitals, and middle-class housing that was unaffordable to the former African American residents. Those who were displaced then relocated to the few other places available, converting inner-ring suburbs like Ferguson into new segregated enclaves. We have been led to believe that racial segregation in housing was de facto segregation, by accident or the result of private prejudices. Yes, private prejudice clearly contributed to segregation, but by itself it could not have segregated the country without the intention of the federal government to segregate neighborhoods throughout the nation. If, however, we understand the accurate history, the history that was once well known but we've all now forgotten, that racially segregated patterns in every metropolitan area like St. Louis were created by de jure segregation, racially explicit policy on the part of federal, state, and local governments designed to segregate metropolitan areas, then we can understand that we have an unconstitutional residential landscape. And if it's unconstitutional, then we have an obligation to remedy it. The federal government in the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration of the 1930s pursued policies in the mid-20th century that segregated metropolitan areas. One important policy was the first civilian public housing program, which frequently demolished integrated neighborhoods in order to create segregated public housing. In the late 1930s, another New Deal program, the United States Housing Authority, was adopted. The very first projects built under the United States Housing Authority authorization were in Austin, Texas, because the most aggressive proponent of public housing at that time was the congressman from Austin, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson got the United States Housing Authority to put its first projects in Austin, separate projects for whites, for African Americans, and a project for Hispanics. The project for African Americans was placed in a location that the city plan of Austin had designated as a ghetto for African Americans. The United States Housing Authority and the local Austin Housing Authority demolished something called Emancipation Park, which was a celebrations location for the abolition of slavery. The design was to move all African Americans in the city of Austin into this community, whether in public housing or in private housing. The city of Austin then began to close schools for African Americans elsewhere in the city and close libraries and other public facilities to force African Americans to move to the east side. Another program that the federal government pursued to enforce segregation was the work of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which subsidized the development of suburbs like Levittown, New York, on condition that they only be sold to white families and that the homes in those suburbs had deeds that prohibited resale to African Americans. The Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual said that inharmonious racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured. Government at all levels throughout the nation were involved in promoting and enforcing the restrictive deeds in homes and places like Levittown, and judges enforced the view that these deeds did not violate the Constitution because they were private agreements. Although white middle-class families that moved into suburbs like Levittown could buy property with no down payments if they were veterans and low-interest mortgages, middle-class African Americans had to make substantial down payments and get uninsured mortgages with higher interest rates. In many, if not most cases, African Americans could not get mortgages at all because the federal government would not insure them. As a result, they bought their homes on contract, like an installment plan where they accumulated no equity and could be evicted from their homes in the event of a single missed payment. Thus, contract buyers do not have the option of leaving a declining neighborhood before their properties were paid for in full. If they did, they would lose everything they'd invested in that property to date. The term redlining comes from the federal government's creation of maps of urban areas nationwide. And those maps were color-coded to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. Anywhere African Americans lived, even places where African Americans lived nearby, were colored red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky for the FHA to insure. The FHA's justification was that if African Americans bought homes in white neighborhoods, or even if they bought homes near those neighborhoods, the property values of the homes they were insuring, the white homes they were insuring, would decline, and therefore their loans would be at risk. In 1940, for example, a Detroit builder was denied FHA insurance for a project that was near an African American neighborhood. He then constructed a half-mile concrete wall, 6 feet high and a foot thick, separating the two neighborhoods, and then the FHA approved the loan. In the 3 decades during which it administered this policy, however, the agency never provided or obtained evidence to support its claim that integration undermined property values. In fact, often racial integration caused property values to increase because African Americans' housing supply was so restricted and they had so many fewer choices. If African Americans had access to housing throughout metropolitan areas, supply and demand balances would have kept their rents and home prices at reasonable levels. Without access, landlords and sellers were free to take advantage of the greater demand relative to supply for African American housing. A 1946 National Magazine article described a Chicago building where the landlord had divided a 540-square-foot storefront into 6 cubicles, each housing a family. He had similarly subdivided the second story. Total monthly rent was as great as that generated by a luxury apartment on Chicago's Gold Coast along Lake Michigan. Such exploitation was possible only because public policy denied African Americans opportunities to participate in the city's white housing market. As the federal government concentrated low-income African Americans in single neighborhoods, the homes became overcrowded. Families had to subdivide their homes to make their mortgage payments or their property tax payments. Cities frequently withdrew public services from African American neighborhoods. They collected garbage less frequently. They didn't provide water and sewer services. Polluting industry and toxic waste plants were placed in African American communities in order to protect white neighborhoods from deterioration. The result was that African American neighborhoods frequently turned into slums. White homeowners looked at these places and assumed that slum conditions were characteristics of African Americans, not of government policy that forced this kind of overcrowding. White homeowners then became resistant to African Americans moving into their neighborhoods because they thought they would bring slum conditions with them. Of course, the slums were not created by the people. They were created by the forced concentration, the overcrowding in these neighborhoods. Blockbusting was a scheme in which speculators bought properties in borderline black-white areas, rented or sold them to African American families at above-market prices, persuaded white families residing in these areas that their neighborhoods were turning into African American slums and that values would soon fall precipitously, and then purchased the panicked white homes for less than their worth. Blockbusters' tactics included hiring African American women to push carriages with their babies through white neighborhoods, hiring African American men to drive cars with radios blasting through white neighborhoods, or making random telephone calls to residents of white neighborhoods and asking to speak to someone with a stereotypically African American name, like Johnny May. State licensing agencies that regulated real estate agents could have easily stopped this practice. All they had to do was to lift the license of 1 or 2 real estate agents who engaged in these practices, and the practices would have ended. While many de jure segregation policies aimed to keep African Americans far from white residential areas, public officials also shifted African American populations away from downtown business districts so that white commuters, shoppers, and business elites would not be exposed to black people. This was accomplished with slum clearance. One slum clearance tool was the construction of the federal interstate highway system. In many cases, state and local governments, with federal acquiescence, designed interstate highway routes to destroy urban African American communities. In the 1950s, there was a white middle-class neighborhood in Los Angeles that wealthy African Americans began to move into. It was called Sugar Hill. The first thing that happened was that the neighborhood association got together and tried to buy out the African American families who were moving in, offering them more money than the African Americans had paid in order to get them out of the neighborhood. When that didn't work, white homeowners tried to enforce a legal agreement prohibiting them from living in the neighborhood. And when that didn't work, the city council then decided it would be an African American neighborhood. It rezoned it for multiple family housing. It eventually became a slum. And then the Santa Monica Freeway was built to clear that slum to destroy the neighborhood. So these policies all worked together in an unconstitutional fashion to segregate Los Angeles. In 1957, Bill and Daisy Myers were able to purchase a home in Levittown, Pennsylvania, the Levitt Company's second large development. When the mail carrier discovered that he was delivering mail to an African-American family, he let everyone in the neighborhood know, and as many as 600 white demonstrators soon showed up in front of the Myers' house, pelting the family and their home with rocks. Law enforcement stood by as this happened. For 2 months, rocks were thrown, crosses were burned, the Ku Klux Klan symbol was painted on the wall next door. Some policemen stood with the mob, joking and encouraging its participants. One sergeant was actually demoted to patrolman because he objected to orders he had been given not to interfere with the rioters. In 1951, World War II veteran Harvey Clark, his wife Janetta, and 2 small children rented an apartment in Old White Cicero, a suburb of Chicago. When the Clarks refused to leave, a mob of 4,000 rioted, raiding the apartment, destroying the fixtures, and throwing the family's belongings out the window onto the lawn where they were set ablaze. Time magazine reported that the police officers present, quote, acted like ushers politely handling the overflow at a football stadium, unquote. The only people that the grand jury indicted were Harvey Clark, his real estate agent, his NAACP attorney, and the white landlady who rented the apartment to him, as well as her attorney, on charges of inciting a riot and conspiring to lower property values. Stories like this were commonplace, and state-sponsored violence was a means, along with many others, by which all levels of government maintained segregation. Today, African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. But African American wealth is about 10% of white wealth. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes. So this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. African American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration, gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. Across the country in new developments, these homes in the late 1940s and 1950s sold for about twice national median income. They were affordable to working-class families with an FHA or VA mortgage. African Americans were equally able to afford those homes as whites, but were prohibited from buying them. Today, those homes sell for $300,000 to $400,000 at the minimum, 6 to 8 times national median income. The white families sent their children to college with the wealth they gained from appreciating home equity. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children. None of those advantages accrued to African Americans, who for the most part were prohibited from buying homes in those suburbs. So in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you're now free to buy homes in the suburbs that had been forbidden. But it's an empty promise, because those homes are no longer affordable to the families whose parents or grandparents could have afforded them when whites were buying into those suburbs and gaining the equity and wealth that followed from their purchases. Consider children who come from families where they're economically stressed, or in poor health because they have no access to good health care, or because they live in polluted environments. When they do come to school, for example, they may suffer from asthma because of that pollution and are drowsy from being awake at night, wheezing. They cannot then typically achieve at levels of children who come to school well rested. When you concentrate children like that in single classrooms, it's impossible for teachers to develop the kind of outcomes that they can in middle-class children who come to school healthy, unstressed, and able to pay attention to schooling. What economists know is that African American children from low-income families who grow up in segregated neighborhoods are less likely as adults to move into the middle class than are African American children whose families have the same low incomes but who live in integrated neighborhoods. So segregation itself impedes intergenerational mobility and perpetuates, rigidifies the inequality that we experience. Another thing that social psychologists have discovered is that decision-making is hampered when you don't have diverse decision-making groups. These psychologists have done experiments where they put people together to solve problems in both diverse groups and in segregated groups. And the diverse groups are much better able to solve problems because they challenge assumptions much more than the segregated groups do. So segregation impedes our political and economic success. We have 3 provisions in the federal Constitution that prohibit the kinds of actions that federal, state, and local governments pursue to create residential segregation. One is the Fifth Amendment, which requires the federal government to treat all citizens fairly. Another is the 14th Amendment that requires state and local governments not only to treat citizens fairly, but to treat them equally. And then the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, also requires that we banish the effects of slavery, which Congress long ago determined was any form of second-class citizenship. So in fact, the prohibition on African Americans to purchase homes in federally subsidized white communities or the segregation of public housing created a form of second-class citizenship which was a violation of the 13th Amendment. We cannot reverse de jure segregation mainly with lawsuits. We must also build a national political consensus leading to legislation, a challenging but not impossible task. Our focus now should be to develop policies that promote an integrated society, understanding it will be impossible to fully untangle the web of unconstitutional inequality that we've woven. To begin, we should first contemplate what we have collectively done and, on behalf of our government, accept responsibility to fix it.
Wow. And to accept responsibility to fix it. Boy, there's a lot to unpack here. And I don't know about you, but I've learned a lot. I've probably watched this video now 10 times. There's a lot to unpack. Demolishing integrated communities to build segregated public housing, forcing Black families to move to designated locations, creating overcrowding, creating policy that was designed to segregate communities, denying Black U.S. veterans the same access to GI Bill backed by mortgages. As a Vietnam veteran, shame on me for not knowing this. You know, my wife and I sent our kids to college on the equity of our home that we bought in the early 80s. A lot of people were prevented from that. The story of how housing discrimination began before, much deeper than redlining. And NIMBY, as we know, still exists today. I'm going to come back to you, Adetta. I learned a lot. Let's ask our audience today, participants, what they learned.
I got caught. Sorry, everyone. Menti.com, please go back to your browser or your device. You will have a new question, and we just want to get a sense of how much of this information might be new to those of us who are participating today. That's always a hard, I've seen that video, and I always find by the end of it, even though it's a it's a packed 17 minutes. It's enough time to really feel that stuff in your body, you know, Bill, as a Black woman watching that, even knowing all the privileges I have sitting in my house. It's very stressful to me, and I can then only imagine the 100 times more. Been watching the comments from folks who are watching on Facebook and other live streams, and this is a contemporary issue. It's great to understand the history, but many of the things we just watched on that video are happening right now, and people are in the comments talking about that. So thank you for those folks who are speaking up and letting everybody know that this is something that's happening right now. And then one last thing I'll say before I think we're slowing down on our responses, but I'm always so sort of taken aback, as many times as I do hear this story, by the outsized response of white culture to the introduction of Black culture. Sometimes it seemed, you know, one family produced 4,000 people. You know, the ways in which when you challenge white supremacy, and that's what I think was being expressed in that video, individual people are who they are, but when you put it all together, it becomes a way of thinking. So white supremacy is that way of thinking that many people are trained in, and it responds in an outsized way, you know, disproportionate way, and kind of annihilates whatever it feels is a threat to it. Sometimes very violently and sometimes quite subtly, but it will find a way to annihilate what it considers a threat. So that always comes home to me when I watch videos like that. Let's see, it looks like our slowdown has happened. And as I was observing kind of in the comments too, some folks are absorbing this. I think we have an interesting mix of folks for whom this is new to semi-new. Some folks are probably living it, and so they know all about it and have been told it from grandma on down. But I think it's why we showed this video today, was to reiterate, people will always need to learn this history. We are not taught it appropriately, and therefore there's always a place to share it and make sure that we have a shared understanding of this history.
Thanks, Adina. You know, what's remarkable to me is I've been involved in affordable housing, you know, since the 70s, starting working with the homeless, and the housing forum's been going since the 80s. I feel pretty informed, and I'm one who learned a lot. So with the transparency that we have today to get this data, and we're going to be looking at some of the data later, we need to both acknowledge our history and, as the video said, take responsibility. So again, thanks, Odetta, for that. We'll come back to the audience again in a moment. I want to shift now to our special guests and talk locally about these issues. I want you to welcome our region's dedicated public servant and historian, DeKalb County, Michael Thurmon. Now, Michael, I know you said just get on with the program, don't do a long introduction, but it's very important. I think we all know you and know who you are, and particularly those of us who live in DeKalb County. But I just want to say that Michael has been a public servant and has played almost every role in the state and local community, an attorney by training. You became the first African-American elected to the Georgia General Assembly in Clark County since Reconstruction. And during his legislative tenure, Thurmond authored major legislation that provided more than $250 million in tax relief to Georgia's senior citizens and working families. I'm one of the seniors now, Michael, so thank you very much.
We both are, Bill. We both are.
He also headed up the Division of Family and Children's Services at a very critical time as we were transitioning from welfare to work, and he created the first Work First program. He was also our labor commissioner, starting in 1998. There, he created Georgia Works program that earned national praise as a bipartisan support. Really, the reason we're asking you, Michael, is you're also a historian. And in conversations we had to get ready for today, you told me that in every position you've been in every role, both in the county as CEO, in the state, as a legislator, you always went back to learn the history of both what you're heading up, but the history of what got us here. So reacting to the video, to this introduction, I want to welcome you, Michael, and thank you for your leadership. We're all very interested in your reflections, and you and I will come back after your reflections and talk a little bit. Thank you, Michael.
Good morning, and Bill, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this very important and timely meeting regarding this forum regarding the Atlanta regional housing and the impact or the lack thereof in terms of affordability and access for all families in this community. I want to repeat something for those who are in attendance this morning, something I said to Bill. He and I have been friends since my DFAX days, which was almost some 35, 40 years ago. But more recent history is important. In DeKalb right now, our top priority in terms of responding to the COVID-19 crisis is food insecurity in DeKalb County. 1 out of every 4 children troubled by and is under the threat of food insecurity. And each month, 1 out of every 4 children. So we place food insecurity and responding to it at the highest level in terms of our response. Obviously, a partnership with the Atlanta Community Food Bank, where Bill is and remains a legend, but also in monthly food distributions. All of that I credit to Bill Bolin and his, over the years, educating and focusing my attention, no matter where I was in the political process, that it all comes back to some very fundamental issues, which is the hierarchy of needs is food, clothing, and shelter. And we're here to discuss shelter. But Bill, I want to thank you for investing in me and focusing my attention on this issue that I carry with me today. And for those in attendance, and this was a powerful, extremely sobering video. And this is the 3rd time that I've watched it, and each time it's painful to watch. I think Odetta said it's painful to watch. But one of the things that Bill and I talked about, that throughout my career, even in my public and private life, it's always important to engage in root cause analysis. And root cause analysis is built on an appreciation and a desire to excavate and to mine and to understand and develop the historical context of any problem that we face. If we do not investigate and write and document the history, oftentimes as public sector leaders, we are oftentimes focused on symptoms as opposed to root cause problem. A symptom, of course, is one thing, but if you really want to address the problem, you have to go to the root cause, which in and of itself requires historical research and analysis. It creates context, helping you know where you are in the spectrum, how far you've come, and more importantly, it plots a course as to where we need to go moving forward. History is important. So when I digested the video, thinking about context and history of the United States of America, particularly people of color, and how housing discrimination and just efforts, de facto, this particular video focuses on the de jure efforts to prohibit and restrict access to fair, affordable housing for people of color. You begin really at the beginning. And as we consider the myriad of state, local, and federal efforts to prevent African Americans and people of color from purchasing property, primarily residential homes, you begin at the beginning when African Americans were property. And so that's where the story begins, in that legally, constitutionally protected right in the United States for African Americans to be enslaved through perpetual bondage. History teaches me that at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, that was a right that was incorporated in the U.S. Constitution. And that right remained such and was respected by legal fiat by courts and through practice and custom throughout these United States from its very inception. Some refer to it as the original sin for our nation. That right to own and enslave people of color and their descendants remain legal in the United States, of course, as was stated in the video, until the spring of 1865, when the 13th Amendment was ratified, abolishing forced servitude and perpetual bondage and the vestiges of that servitude in the United States of America. Therefore, if you think about it, from 1787 to 1865, for 80 plus years, 8 decades, the enslavement of people of color was legal in the United States of America. Then, of course, in 1896, that Plessy versus Ferguson, through in a ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court, affirmed the right to segregate African Americans, and to discriminate against African Americans and people of color by denying them access to public accommodations, restricting them to segregated housing, segregated schools. That then became a right respected and enforced by the United States of America through legislative enactment, through court decree, and through de jure and de facto decision making. That continued to be the law of the United States of America until the mid-1960s. Mid-1960s, my friend, do the math, what, 6 decades ago. I often remind my daughter and other young people, and even myself, that I attended all segregated schools in Athens, Clarke County, where I grew up at, until my senior year in high school at what became Clarke Central High School. I had no interaction. I never really had a conversation with a white child my age until I was 18 years old, a senior at Clarke Central High School in Athens. For the 11 years prior to that, I matriculated in a system that was designed by the state of Georgia to undermine my ability to succeed. It was a system that was separate, and through funding and through legislation was designed to be unequal. And the ultimate purpose of that system was to undermine my ability to be successful as an individual, as a person. Thank God I had parents and family and friends and community and teachers who did not succumb to that legal narrative, but that is in fact was the system that existed in Georgia and across this nation until the mid-1960s. So you can see that for 100 years, segregation was legal. One of the things about the video that I thought was interesting, when it was referencing decisions made in the 40s and the 50s, and even in the early 60s, those were legal decisions. Those were decisions protected by the U.S. Constitution and the federal and state courts of our nation to discriminate, to undermine, and to limit access to housing by people of color. So we move forward to where we are right now. So if you think about the entire scope of history of these United States of America, still the greatest nation on the face of the earth, 233 years of history, 23 decades of our history, but only 6.2 decades have where the laws of our country have at least acknowledged the fact that all people, regardless of race, color, creed, or gender, or sexual orientation, and should have free access opportunity on various levels in our country. Out of the 23 decades, we are only in our 6th decade of at least acknowledging through the law in our courts and in our legislative bodies that all people should be created equal. Why do I go through that? So first of all, understanding how we got to where we are. One of the key points in the video is that this is not by her circumstance. It wasn't inadvertent. The current state of affairs in terms of lack of affordability is the result of decades, if not centuries, of state, local, and federal policy making. And oftentimes these policies on their face don't appear to be discriminatory. That's how systemic racism often works. But in actuality, when the decision comes to rest, for instance, the interstate highway system, which was one of the great modern accomplishments envisioned by President Eisenhower to create and interconnect the United States in a way that it had never been before. Primarily, initially a defense mechanism so that troops and troop movements could move freely, but it had also an impact, inadvertently or advertently, that can be debated. It destroyed and dispersed tens of millions of people of color. It happened in Metro Atlanta. It happened throughout this nation. And that was a decision that on its face appeared to be of no great consequence in terms of race or class, but how it was actually implemented was devastating to property owners, particularly people of color, and dispersed them. It's interesting, the video starts in St. Louis, and obviously Ferguson comes to mind. And anytime I've looked at the arch there in St. Louis, it's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful edifice, and it represents the spirit and the grandness and the grandeur of that part of our nation. But until I saw the video, did not know the backstory in terms of the price that was paid by the people who were living in that area, who were ultimately displaced. So the final thing is, all right, what can we do about it? Or should we do anything about it? Or is it even our problem? That's why this particular forum, I think, is so brilliant. We can't change the past. We can document it, we can discuss it, we can analyze it, but we can reshape the future. You learn from your mistakes, you don't dwell on them. And that is the beauty of history. It's not always pretty. It does not always make us proud. And quite frankly, it's oftentimes heartbreaking in terms of the history of our nation. But we have been a nation that has continued to evolve and continued to, even if not inception, embrace the idea that all men and women were created equal. It is a nation that celebrates the Constitution, that is alive, and that over the centuries and over the decades have continued to expand that definition to what Lincoln said at Gettysburg, that in the Civil War ushered in a new birth of freedom, where that freedom is continuing to be reborn every day in this great nation. It's not just African Americans, but now it's immigrants from every nation across the face of the earth. It's people, no matter what their sexual orientation may be or gender affiliation. It's all Americans recognizing the importance of fair and adequate housing. And finally this, and I'll stop, and let me tell you how we can progress. The fact that I was asked to speak, what Bill didn't tell you is that our speaker today was born in housing that did not have an indoor bathroom, that was a sharecropper shack, that did not afford my family the basic fundamental right of having decent, fair housing. But because we live in this great nation that's America, and because this nation recognizes hard work and faith and determination, and because ultimately we do pursue our better angels, your speaker today was able to rise from that, from those difficult circumstances, to fulfill and achieve a major part of what I believe is the American dream. We can make a difference, one life at a time. We can't be hopeless. We can't be discouraged. We have to do what Bill always does. We have to continue to believe in each other, and more importantly, continue to believe in the greatness of this nation. So thank you so much, Bill, and hopefully those words encapsulated some of what you hoped I would talk about.
Well, it's been great, and you've made it personal. But the point is, it shouldn't be a heroic effort, to get where you are. it shouldn't be heroic. It wasn't heroic for me to get a loan on my house in 1983, to buy a house in DeKalb County. It had to be heroic for African Americans. One of the things we're seeing is demographic trends show us that home buying public is increasingly diverse. 44% of millennials are minorities, 70% of new households between now and 2025 will be minorities. Our nation's population will be a majority minority country by 2045. Is getting this right both a moral imperative as well as a market imperative? We always focus on the market. Today we're looking at policy that affects this, but there's also a moral imperative, that idea that we take responsibility today.
Oh, absolutely. It's morally right. And well, people of faith, whether you're a true believer, agnostic, or atheist, all people of goodwill are, I think, encouraged to try as best they can to ensure that people have shelter, have food, have clothing. And I think it's moral, but let me add another aspect to it. It's self-interest. It's self-interest to ensure that people in this community in Metro Atlanta, as the video pointed out, have access to fair, affordable housing. Why? Because children live there. Children who then, once they are afforded the opportunity, will be more successful in their school. It will increase graduation rates and increase the number of people going to college. Consequently, crime drops and our community benefits because we have citizens who are contributing to the overall best interest of our nation. So yes, it's moral. Yes, it's a policy imperative. But oftentimes human beings are self-interested. So I'm self-interested because I want my family to grow up in a county, in a community free of crime and free of fear. And the most effective way to do that is to educate the population. In order to educate young people, they need to have somewhere that's safe and secure in order for them to live.
I want to encourage folks who are listening in to ask any questions, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. And George, as you get those, you'd put them up on the screen. Michael, isn't there a trust challenge here, a trust issue, that for African Americans who might not trust that government is actually carrying out the policy, or that the legal system is working for them, or that our policy reflects our self-interest for everybody? How do we build back that trust?
Well, first, when you do what you've done today, let's review the history. And that lack of trust is not irrational. And so, if I am distrustful, it's based on my experience and it's based on history. Now, what I can't, and I probably should, what I shouldn't do is to transpose that mistrust onto every Caucasian or white person that I know. But my lack of trust is not irrational. You can look at the video and look at the history of this nation. Now, what in terms of developing strategies, part of the strategy has to be, how do we overcome the lack of trust? We're getting ready now to distribute hundreds of millions of vaccines around this nation. We know that there has been a long history of a malpractice as it relates to African Americans. That strategy has to include a component that deals with the lack of trust among people of color in order for us to be effective to successfully disperse the vaccine to protect all people, including ourselves.
There's a question up of who is the we. I keep talking about the we and accepting responsibility. Who is the we?
It's all of us. It's each and every person. And that's the big debate. Well,
you feel like everybody's got a role.
Absolutely.
No station in life.
Everyone has a role, and the roles are different. And, I don't suggest that everyone has a role to go and march on the state capitol or deliver I Have a Dream speech, but there's a responsibility to talk with your children or your grandchildren, to talk to your friends and neighbors. And, Dr. King said something that I always remember. He said, not what evil men do or evil men say. the media covers the white nationalists, the Aryan nation. Those are not the people that do the most damage. What he said is that when the good people fall south, that's when the damage actually occurs. That's when society begins to become unfrayed. So sitting at the dinner table, talking to your friends, engaging yourself in self-introspection. It can be personal. The most important thing that I do is that to evaluate my own biases. And everyone has them, including me. You have to evaluate them, and you can not allow your biases to control your actions, your thoughts, and who you ally yourself with in order to address problems.
So what you're really saying is that we've really got to change consciousness. We've got to change our attitudes and our knowledge and our motivation to take action, as well as changing policy. Lee Farmer asked the question, how do we trust the government when it continues to act against my best interests? And I want to sparse that a little bit by saying, Michael, as we're kind of addressing federal policy today, federal policy comes down to state policy, and that usually lands at DCA. And then it lands at the county, lands to your door, just as you've had to figure out what to do with CARES money. So whose responsibility? Is it the feds that have to lead? Is it the state that really has to carry out that policy? Or does it really come down to the county and city level?
It's all of the above, but the individual has to vote and participate in the process and to engage the process, to be educated and aware of the decisions that are being made that can be impactful on addressing issues of your concern. Now, I had a conversation with my DeKalb County Commissioner yesterday, and I'm the old guy, Bill. You mentioned it. We old guys. I started out as an up and coming young politician. I'm not that anymore. So this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. The history teaches you this. There is no silver bullet. It's trench warfare in the political arena where every inch, a half inch, a quarter inch has to be fought for, engaged, and paid for through effort and through dedication and commitment.
Absolutely. David Couchman asked, to your knowledge, are you aware of examples in the Atlanta area that are similar to the issues in the video? David, you're doing good work up in the Sandy Springs area, addressing affordable housing. It's going on everywhere. The example for me that came up because I was working at St. Luke's Church back in the late 70s is Buttermilk Bottom, where the Atlantic Civic is now in housing. I mean, that was a community that had been there for 100 years. And the whole community got bulldozed away to build a civic center and housing that nobody could afford. Can you think of other examples?
Well, I can think of one that we're dealing with right now in DeKalb County. We are having to rebuild and invest $1.3 billion in DeKalb's water and sewer system. Well, as we analyze this, and we just finished a modification that's now before a federal judge, even when Blacks actually were able to purchase homes, what we discovered was that over the years, DeKalb failed to properly maintain the water and sewer system. So we had 24 million gallons of spills this year, 22 million was in South DeKalb. Because that system had been disinvested and we had invested the money in other parts of the county. So even when you're able to purchase the home or own the home, the valuation on the home is undermined because we government did not make the proper investment to maintain the water and sewer system. So that's what, when I was watching the video, that's what I thought about.
Came up for you. Yeah. I'm going to end with this question, and it really is a vision question. Tess Knight says, what is your vision for future affordable housing in DeKalb County? I'm going to let you answer that, Michael, and then we're going to turn to looking actually at some real mapping of the area.
Well, first, we have to continue to address the issue of gentrification. DeKalb has a huge number of homeowners who are men and women of color, families of color. It was an amazing point made in the video that African Americans, a disproportionate amount of our wealth is in our homes. And without home ownership, you're really undermining the ability to build wealth, and particularly generational wealth. Often overlooked is the role of taxation in maintaining that ownership. So that's why we implemented here a tax credit that goes to ad valorem taxpayers to offset the cost of increasing taxation. Our ad valorem tax base increased by 11%. That's good news, but what normally follows is your taxes increase as well to make owning that home less affordable. So one of the things we've done through our sales eSplosh is to offset those tax increases for current homeowners. Less first for people, men and women who spent 30 and 40 years buying the home, have paid off the mortgage. Let's not allow taxation to force them to leave DeKalb because they can't afford to pay the tax commissioner. That's number one. Number two, we're investing in making sure that we do everything we can to remove blight and litter and other crime, wherever it is, to undercut and diminish the value of the homes that we do have. That's important. And of course, when any new development, say at Doraville, we've included requirements to have affordable units. So most of the focus is on new units. The only thing I would suggest as a discussion point is what else can we do to protect those homeowners who've already paid through their work and their commitment. They are homeowners now, to protect them against sharp increases in taxation that ultimately forces them to sell in order for them to continue to have a quality of life.
Excellent point, and very much what SOAR is trying to address, kind of after the fact. In food banking, we used to feed people every day, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, but somebody has to go up the river and say, who's throwing them in? Throwing them in is the policy that we're making. Who's throwing them in is not carrying out that policy. Michael, when we were prepping for this, we said, when we get started, we could go all day, and maybe we'll have you back. I want to thank you for your lifetime of service to this region, for being both an effective leader, a transparent leader, a leader that brings people together, but maybe most importantly, being a moral leader. So thank you for that service. Thanks for taking time to be with us today. And let me encourage folks, go out and vote. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks, Bill. And for all who are listening, do not grow weary in your good doing. Just don't grow weary. Just keep fighting.
Just keep showing up.
Keep showing up.
Thank you, man. Now let's we're starting to run out of time. We're a little bit behind, but let's move for a moment to look at mapping segregation then and now. What actions are most likely combat the effect of segregation and create more affordable housing? Is that the question, Odetta? You're on mute.
So sorry, everybody. Yes, so we have gotten a lot of information for some folks, had information reinforced for others, but we want to get to the doing, right? Reverend C.T. Vivian said the power is in the doing. So we're intrigued to know what participants feel are some of the actions that will help to combat segregation. We want to create affordable housing. We know there's a policy role in all of that, but there's also the community building, that sense of personal journey and transformation that we have to take. Again, we talk in big themes of the federal government and white supremacy. Those are all created by individual people who have to commit to a lifelong journey of retraining their thoughts about Black people and anti-Blackness. So community building and rebuilding those good connections along with policy are sort of, I think, a more winning combination to get us a little bit further down the road. And definitely, I'm so glad to see a good chunk of folks agree that community building is important, but also we've got to address zoning. That I think reflects the participants' understanding of some of those underlying policy issues. Capital is really big. I bet Joel Dixon, who I know is watching, hit that one a bunch of times. Capital for developers of all kinds. We've really got to figure out that ecosystem and just get some money in folks' hands, right? down payment assistance and finding ways to reform some of the programs like low-income housing tax credits so they work better for folks. I think folks kind of want to see a little bit of everything. They want a full toolbox, Bill.
Well, it takes a full toolbox, doesn't it? And I really would come back to that community building is coming back to building trust in each other's roles and who's actually going to take action. So very helpful to us, and this really informs us as we look to 2021 about things we need to address.
Absolutely.
So thanks, Odetta. Let me just move quickly because I think it's always important. We can talk philosophically, but we always go to our old friend Mike over at ARC to say, show it to me. Mike, can you show us some mapping of the region?
Yes, Bill, thank you so much. And I'm going to try to get us back on time, but as you know, I'm usually the worst person in the world to try to get us back on time. Again, my name is Mike Carnathan. I head up the Research and Analytics Group with the Atlanta Regional Commission. And today I'm going to be talking about exactly what the screen says. I'm going to try to tell a story and to visualize segregation in Metro Atlanta and how segregation is playing out in Metro Atlanta and why it still matters. And of course, you know, anybody who goes to this housing forum regularly, who's read The Color of Law, who or even just saw that video, I'm not going to tell you anything that you don't already know. So one thing that I do want to emphasize is segregation's role in the system that is Metro Atlanta. And just to remind you, this is what I'm talking about when I say the system of Metro Atlanta. It's a system that sees that we have the lowest rates of upward economic mobility in the nation. We also have the highest rates of suburbanization of poverty. And if you look just at the city, the system has created the highest levels of income inequality in the nation as well. And so, you know, and this system has been built over generations and generations. And so I'm going to just very quickly go through some slides trying to visualize that. And of course, we're going to start where we started this housing forum off and talking about redlining and talking about really the infamous redlining map, where in an effort to promote home ownership, which on the face is good intentions, what happened was we created this map that actually labeled neighborhoods to help guide where lending would go. We have best neighborhoods, we have still desirable neighborhoods, and then we have neighborhoods defined, labeled as definitely declining and even hazardous. I mean, hazardous. And to me, I mean, that just boggles my mind that we would label neighborhoods where people live as hazardous. But that's exactly what happened. And, you know, that just kind of goes back to that old adage, you know, that we know about, you know, roads paved with good intentions. And we're still dealing with this kind of system today. So if you look, and this is our attempt of trying to re-aggregate data to all those little slivers. But if you look at those neighborhoods today that were defined hazardous, and this is 80 years ago, let me remind you, 80 years ago, they still have, you know, almost triple the poverty rate as those desirable and best neighborhoods. And so this is just one of those situations where we're still grappling with intentional policy decisions that were made generations ago. Let's move fast forward a little bit and let's look at 1970. And this is really going to be talking a lot about what CEO Thurmond was talking about. Here we're looking at average family income. The red areas are the wealthiest neighborhoods in 1970, and the blue areas represent the poorest neighborhoods in 1970. And then back in 1970, there was such a thing as rural poverty. And so that's what you're really seeing on the exurban fringes. But what you do see is, you know, these areas in Buckhead and East Cobb, those were among the wealthiest neighborhoods then, and they're among the wealthiest neighborhoods now. But look at South DeKalb, look at Fulton, and look at Clayton County. Clayton County was the embodiment of middle-class living in 1970, where you had some wealthiest neighborhoods, you had some poor neighborhoods, but mostly you just had these middle-class neighborhoods. Okay, so that's 1970 expressed in, you know, somewhat more current dollars. Now we're going to fast forward to a more recent picture of family income. And you'll see that the wealthiest areas, kind of those areas in Buckhead and Sandy Springs and East Cobb, well, they're still the wealthiest neighborhoods today. But what happened in DeKalb? What happened in Fulton? What happened in Clayton? And, yes, 70, that's 50 years ago. And 50 years ago seems like a long time. But, I mean, we're talking a couple of generations after seeing the fortunes of these neighborhoods completely flip. So we're going to keep going in our time machine. Now, here we're looking at non-Black populations, then and now. And so in 1990, and I'm just using an arbitrary, kind of binning here. In 1990, you see that the majority of the region was non-Black. Now, of course, in 1990, what that meant was we're a very biracial place in 1990. So, it was mostly Black populations or white populations. Now, you fast forward to 2018, and you'll see, the same areas that were, majority non-Black in 1990 are still majority non-Black in 2018. And that's mostly the northern and southern bits of the region. Now, the other areas, now we're not a biracial place anymore. So now, non-Black populations mean lots of other races and ethnicities are in the mix. But I'm going to focus on the Black populations. So here in the region is the areas that were majority Black in both 1990 and 2018. So kind of, start to form this picture in your head, because this is sort of the system that's really been building for generations and generations. So here's what it looked like, again, majority Black in both 1990 and 2018. I'm going to move to the next quadrant where it was less than 50% Black in 1990 and greater than 50% Black in 2018. And so you'll see how that kind of just moved sort of out a little bit, kind of in that bowl of the region, mostly south of I-20. Continuing in the quadrant, so these are the areas that were both less than 50% Black in both 1990 and 2018. And you'll see that's just really dominated by north of I-20. And then finally, to kind of complete the loop around the quadrants, here are the neighborhoods that were greater than 50% Black in 1990 and less than 50% Black in 2018. And you'll see there's just not many of those. And so that's why I had to sort of zoom in. And people who have lived in Atlanta a long time, like me, we've seen this. We've seen this play out in East Atlanta, in Grant Park, in Inman Park, Candler Park, Lake Claire, Kirkwood, Decatur. We know exactly what's happening there. So now, let's fast forward to today, and let's talk a little bit about some of the ramifications of this segregation pattern. And so here, the group at Neighborhood Nexus sort of created two different boundaries. One that sort of bounds the census tracts where at least 50% of the population is Black or African American. And then in the blue outlines are where those census tracts where 25% or more of the residents are Hispanic. So just sort of take a little picture of that. And here's why this matters, right? So if you look at income, and the darker the violets here, the lower the income. Those boundaries for both the Black population and the Hispanic populations almost perfectly explain the distribution of income. Look at housing affordability. And again, here, the darker the colors represents the greater the cost burden. And here, cost burden means if you're paying more than 30% of your income on housing, you are considered to be cost burden. So you look at that, and again, these boundaries where, we're talking about a majority Black population and a significant proportion of Hispanic populations, they almost perfectly describe the distribution of cost burden in this region. And then finally, if we look at the United Way's Child Wellbeing Index, the Child Wellbeing Index was created so people like me who just make map after map after map can really just kind of focus on one map. Well, those boundaries also kind of perfectly explain those areas, or perfectly encompass those areas of low child well-being. So we're going to move on, and we're going to talk about the system a little bit more. So we're going to zoom out a little bit, and we're going to look at how things are distributed. And we're going to go very quickly through this. So this is the percent of the population with a bachelor's degree. Take a picture of that, kind of memorize that pattern if you already have it. So this is the college educated. This is the life expectancy. Same basic pattern where the highest life expectancy is up in the north, with some pockets down in the south in Fayette County. Broadband availability. So the highest percentage of households with access to broadband, again, sort of in the northern parts. And this is very critical today in the pandemic when more and more people are accessing services from their computer. And it'll continue to be important as we move forward. Housing value, again, same basic pattern. Poverty, same basic pattern. The colors are flipped now. Single parent families, same basic pattern. The color is flipped. So when we talk about the system, when we're trying to visualize the system, really two kind of shapes take form. And I know a lot of you have seen me try to draw these shapes. I'm still terrible at it, but you'll see in the northern parts of the region that kind of that inverted triangle. That's where the best, I guess the highest rates of socioeconomics are, and then kind of this heart shape that really starts in sort of Marietta, goes down through Atlanta, through Clayton, back up through South DeKalb, catches some Norcross and comes down. Those are where the most challenging socioeconomics are. And it doesn't matter what map you make. This is just sort of that system's look. All right, so now I need to finish up. And since I'm at a housing forum, I guess I need to talk about housing. And I added this slide literally 5 minutes ago because we were talking about the wealth gap and just how vast that wealth gap is. And so we actually asked a question about that on our Metro Atlanta Speak survey, and essentially just asking respondents saying, okay, if a typical family has 100 units of wealth, how many units of wealth does a typical Black family have? And here, this slide is just showing you how wrong yes, some jurisdictions, Black families have about half the wealth of white families. Well, the actual answer is Black families have about 10% of the wealth. So that's, again, just kind of pointing us to where the conversation really needs to be centered. Lots of education here. We also asked them, how confident are you that you're going to be able to make next month's mortgage or rent? And again, this is just re-emphasizing what we already know, is that Black respondents, Latinx respondents were significantly more likely to indicate some struggles of paying next month's rent. And then finally, we mentioned at the very beginning when we were talking about SOAR, we know that evictions are coming. We know they are. And so here what we did is we looked at where eviction filings are going. And these are filings, not evictions. And in the 100 census tracts in the region where has the highest eviction filing rate, well, 82% of populations in those 100 census tracts are persons of color. And then you compare that to 58% of persons of color for all other tracts. And so the pandemic is really exposing these systemic inequalities and inequities that have existed before the pandemic. Now I'm going to go through a couple of maps and really kind of focus on housing. And so here we're looking at the latest Home Mortgage Disclosure Act and where home purchases are actually going. And this is just all home purchases, right? And so you'll see the dark browns represent, those areas that I guess are hot markets or where, houses are being bought at a higher rate. And you'll see it's all over the region. Every single jurisdiction, every single county, every single city has little pockets of where just overall home purchases are happening. But with this data set, we can also kind of cut this by the race of the buyer. And so here is where home purchases to white homeowners are going. Does that pattern look familiar to you at all? It should. Here's where the home purchases to Black homeowners are going. And again, very similar pattern. And so what this is suggesting is that, you know, we have this system in place, and, you know, just judged on recent home buying patterns, we're really kind of codifying that. We're really sort of further strengthening that system. We can also look at it where Latinx homeowners are going, and you'll see, you know, just Gwinnett County really kind of dominates home buying for the Latinx community, and then Asian homeowners, again, Gwinnett County and North Fulton. So now I have 2 more slides to go, and the question I was trying to answer is, okay, well, what's changing here? I mean, are we seeing some sort of shift in the latest home buying data? And so what I'm looking at, very similar to those previous maps I've shown you, is I'm looking at where the majority of home buyers are white, but yet the majority of residents are Black. And here it is, kind of the same map that we've been seeing. You'll see, you know, in areas of city of Atlanta, you know, especially around the Beltline, where you see majority of homeowners being white, majority of residents are Black. We can flip that. Where are the majority of homeowners that are Black buying in neighborhoods where the majority of residents are white? And you'll see these 2 neighborhoods in Henry County. And Henry County is one of those examples that we've seen, you know, pretty radical demographic shifts. And so all of this is just to say is, you know, what we're seeing, at least with the recent data, is we're not really nudging that system into a different place, much less dismantling it. The pandemic and some recent trends that we're looking at are actually kind of solidifying that system. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and hopefully we have a time for a question or 2.
Well, we don't have much time, Michael, but let me come back to, I'm a visual learner, and I always look forward to your presentation because, you know, seeing is believing for me. But I think what you've done in your presentation, and you actually said the words during the presentation, this informs where the conversation needs to be. That it affects our ability to educate our children, it affects the environment, it affects our sense of security. It certainly affects people's ability to create wealth. And without that, we're always behind. So in the interest of time, I want to thank you for being here yet again today, Mike, and for all the work that you do at ARC. Very, very important. As we're wrapping up, and thanks for all the folks who have stayed with us. Let me thank you for being here. Hopefully 2021 is going to be a better year, and that we might gather at some point. I think in many ways we've created our own roadmap of what we need to focus on. I want to thank Odetta for being here and helping us learn more about the issues and the folks on this call. And I encourage folks to track her work at ARC at Transformation Alliance. She works on it every day. So thank you, Odetta. Thanks again, George, for being the producer of this program. You know, we've seen the map. We now know the history, and you can't unknow it. We've also seen the outcome of bad policy. And we've also heard from Michael to say that it's not only a market issue or a legal issue, but it's also a moral issue, and that we all have a role. And our role might be to work directly in this field. Some of us are actually working on affordable housing, and we've got a role. Some of us are educating ourselves and our circle around us. So I encourage people to do this. Share this video, share the book. And some of us really move into advocacy, and there's going to be opportunities to let our county commissioners know, our state know, our federal government know what the priorities are and what we want to support. So I want to thank everyone for their work. I want you to stay safe over the holidays. Get your vaccine when they're available, but certainly get your flu shot. Vote. Vote. It's coming up, and we've shown tremendous outcomes. It's important that we all are there in that capacity. So thank you all for the Housing Forum participation today. We look forward to seeing you in the new year. Happy holidays. Stay safe. Stay healthy. Thank you.